Nearly 3 weeks after the tragedy that stunned Hollywood, the house behind the white gates in Brentwood still feels unnaturally quiet, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. The headlines moved fast, as they always do, reducing a complex human collapse into a few shocking lines. But the real story sits deeper, in the pauses, in the unanswered phone calls, and in the long years of tension no camera ever captured. On a calm Sunday afternoon in mid-December, a routine appointment became the first crack in that silence. A massage therapist arrived, as she had so many times before, expecting the familiar rhythm of a household that prized routine and control. Yet the door never opened, the bell echoed unanswered, and the stillness felt wrong in a way that cannot be explained until it is felt in the body. Concern turned into panic, and panic turned into a phone call that would pull the family's private suffering into the harsh light of public scrutiny. When Romy Reiner rushed to the mansion, she was not bracing for horror, only for inconvenience or confusion, the kind that resolves itself once someone answers the door. What she encountered instead split her life into a before and an after so violent that her mind simply shut down. She did not scream for help or reach for her phone in a clear, orderly way. She froze, collapsed, and ran, her nervous system overwhelmed by a sight no child is prepared to witness. The call for help came from the man beside her, a quiet but critical detail that would later be twisted, misreported, and dissected online, as if shock followed logic, as if trauma asked permission before it took control. From the outside, the Reiner family had long represented a certain Hollywood ideal: success earned through talent, stability built on loyalty, a life protected by gates and manicured hedges. At the center of it all stood Rob Reiner, a man whose work celebrated empathy, humanity, and the belief that people, at their core, could be understood if only you listened closely enough. Yet inside that home, empathy had been stretched to its breaking point. For years, friends would later say, Rob confided in whispers about a fear he rarely allowed himself to speak out loud. Fear not of strangers or career failure, but of the slow unraveling happening under his own roof. Police had been called to the address before, quietly, repeatedly, each visit ending without headlines, each departure leaving behind the same unresolved dread. To neighbors, the flashing lights were anomalies in a peaceful street, brief interruptions that vanished by morning. To the family, they were reminders that something fundamental was slipping beyond control. This was not the story of one sudden explosion, but of pressure building invisibly, reinforced by love, denial, and hope that tomorrow would finally be different. The early hours after the discovery did not bring clarity, only confusion amplified by rumor. Reports claimed things that never happened, suggested motives that were never spoken, and in the chaos of breaking news, a grieving daughter found herself silently judged by people who had never known her. What mattered most in those first moments was not speculation, but the fragile thread of truth held together by witnesses, timelines, and the simple fact of human shock. Investigators moved carefully, not because of suspicion born from malice, but because proximity always demands answers. Who arrived first? Who saw what? Who was present when the world fell apart? In that process, the presence of another person beside Romy became a quiet safeguard, a grounding force that anchored reality when emotion threatened to distort everything. As the story unfolded, it became clear that the tragedy was not contained within that single afternoon. It was the culmination of years marked by cycles of hope and relapse, of parental devotion tested by forces no amount of money or influence could fully manage. Behind the serene exterior of the mansion lived a family constantly adjusting its behavior around volatility, learning to read moods, to anticipate storms, to survive on vigilance. Love was abundant, but boundaries were fragile, and the line between protection and enabling blurred until it nearly disappeared. This opening chapter is not about assigning blame or simplifying pain. It is about understanding how silence can grow louder than screams, how routine can hide warning signs in plain sight, and how a family that appeared unbreakable slowly fractured under the weight of unspoken fear. The tragedy did not arrive as a stranger. It arrived as something the family had been living alongside for years, hoping it would never fully reveal itself. And when it finally did, it left behind questions that refuse easy answers, questions about responsibility, mental illness, and the devastating cost of loving someone you cannot save. Long before the sirens ever reached the Brentwood gates, the shape of this family's life had already been set by a complicated balance of brilliance and burden. Rob Reiner's public story is one of creative confidence and moral clarity, a filmmaker whose work often insisted that people are more than their worst moments, that empathy is an act of courage. That worldview did not come from comfort alone. It was forged in a lifetime of observing how private pain hides behind public success, a lesson he carried both into his art and into his home. Friends say he was a man who listened more than he spoke, who absorbed the emotions of the people around him, and who believed deeply in the power of patience and understanding. That belief shaped the way he raised his children, creating a household where mistakes were met with conversation rather than punishment, where second chances were not rare exceptions, but a guiding principle. Michelle shared that same instinct. Together, they built a family culture centered on inclusion and protection, a place where no one was ever meant to feel abandoned. In their early years, the home was described as warm and lively, filled with long dinners that stretched into the night, conversations about art and politics, and an unspoken agreement that family always came first. The children grew up surrounded by opportunity, but also by a constant expectation of kindness. There is little room for cruelty or indifference in that environment, and when problems emerged, they were approached with the same philosophy Rob used in his work. Understand the cause, and you can heal the effect. As the children grew older, those ideals were tested in ways no one could have anticipated. Nick's struggles did not arrive all at once. They crept in gradually, first as mood swings that seemed explainable, then as behaviors that felt unsettling but still manageable. There were periods of calm that convinced the family they were making progress, followed by sudden regressions that erased months of hope in a single night. Each cycle deepened the parents' commitment to helping him, reinforcing their belief that consistency and unconditional support would eventually break through. Rehab stays became part of the family vocabulary, spoken about quietly, almost clinically, as if naming them too emotionally would give them more power than they deserved. Romy and her siblings learned early how to live alongside instability without letting it define them. They adapted in different ways, carving out personal identities that allowed them to function even when the atmosphere at home felt uncertain. Romy gravitated toward creative work, finding structure and meaning in projects that demanded focus and emotional honesty. Movement became her coping mechanism. When things felt heavy, she stayed busy, traveling, collaborating, building a sense of forward motion that kept her grounded. That outward resilience masked a deeper sensitivity, one she later acknowledged had always been there, inherited not through genetics alone, but through the emotional climate of her upbringing. Behind closed doors, Rob carried his own history with depression, a quiet companion that never fully left him. He rarely framed it as an illness, more as a weight he had learned to manage through discipline and purpose. Work gave him direction, family gave him motivation, and together they formed a shield strong enough to function, if not to heal. Romy would later recognize those same patterns in herself, the same emotional gravity that pulled her inward during moments of stillness. In her teenage years, it surfaced as anxiety and dark dreams that frightened her precisely because they felt so foreign to the life she appeared to be living. Speaking about it publicly years later was her way of breaking a cycle of silence she now understood too well. Nick's path diverged sharply. While his parents focused on support and stability, his internal world grew more fragmented. Diagnoses came, bringing explanations but not relief. Schizophrenia reframed past behaviors, casting them in a new, more alarming light. Medication brought temporary calm, but side effects and adjustments created their own turbulence. Addiction layered itself over everything else, complicating treatment and blurring the line between illness and choice. For the family, each relapse felt like a personal failure, a sign they had missed something or done something wrong. The instinct to protect only intensified, insulating Nick from consequences in the hope that safety would lead to recovery. From the outside, the family's life still looked enviable. Red carpet appearances presented unity and confidence, moments frozen in photographs that suggested nothing was wrong. But those closest to them noticed subtle changes. Rob's laughter became more guarded. Michelle's concern lingered even in celebratory moments. Conversations drifted back, again and again, to the same subject: how to help a son they loved without losing themselves in the process. The house remained beautiful, but the emotional architecture inside, it was under constant strain, held together by routines designed to prevent disaster rather than to create peace. This background matters because it reveals that the tragedy was not born of neglect or indifference. It emerged from years of effort, sacrifice, and an almost unshakable belief in redemption. The family's past is a study in how love can sustain and exhaust at the same time, how patience can become endurance, and how silence, even when motivated by compassion, can allow danger to grow unnoticed. Understanding who they were before everything fell apart does not make what happened easier to accept, but it makes it impossible to dismiss as a simple story of failure. It was the story of people trying again and again to do the right thing, even as the ground beneath them slowly gave way. The days leading up to December 14th carried a tension that no one outside the family could see, yet those closest to the Reiners felt it pressing in from every side. What once felt like manageable instability had shifted into something sharper, more volatile, as if the familiar patterns were no longer responding to the same interventions. Subtle changes began appearing weeks earlier, small enough to dismiss individually, but impossible to ignore when viewed together. Nick's medication had recently been adjusted, a decision made with hope and professional guidance. Yet the effects were almost immediate and deeply unsettling. His moods no longer followed a predictable rhythm. Calm moments fractured without warning, replaced by agitation that came on fast and left everyone guessing which version of him would appear next. Rob and Michelle started measuring their days by his emotional temperature, altering plans, canceling commitments, and rarely leaving him alone for long. Fear crept into their conversations, spoken softly at first, then with increasing urgency behind closed doors. Friends later recalled how Rob's voice changed during those final weeks. He still spoke with care, still searched for understanding, but there was a new edge beneath his words, a quiet admission that love alone was no longer enough to keep everyone safe. He described his son as unpredictable, not with anger, but with the weary realism of a parent who has exhausted every tool he knows. Michelle mirrored that anxiety. Her instinct had always been to soothe, to de-escalate, to believe that gentleness could guide them through anything. Now, even she seemed unsure which step to take next. The house in Brentwood, once a refuge, had become a place of constant vigilance, where sleep came lightly and silence felt threatening rather than peaceful. The night of the Christmas party only amplified those fears. It was meant to be a brief escape, a chance to step into a familiar social world where laughter and routine might offer relief. They insisted on bringing Nick with them, unwilling to leave him alone, even though he was not on the guest list. The decision was made out of protection, not denial. From the moment they arrived, it was clear he was not grounded in the same reality as everyone else in the room. While guests mingled easily, Nick drifted along the edges, detached and restless, his presence drawing attention for all the wrong reasons. He did not participate, did not smile, did not engage in the subtle give and take of conversation. Instead, he repeated the same question again and again, flat and mechanical, asking people if they were famous, as if the answer held some private significance only he understood. What unsettled those who witnessed it was not rudeness, but the absence of recognition in his eyes. There was no curiosity, no humor, only a loop he could not break. Rob's embarrassment quickly turned into frustration. In a moment that would later haunt him, he raised his voice, urging his son to stop, to behave, to recognize the discomfort he was causing. Michelle stepped in immediately, trying to soften the exchange, but the damage was already done. The room fell silent, and the family left soon after, the drive home heavy with a sense that something fundamental had shifted. That public confrontation was not the cause of what followed, but it was a clear sign that the balance they had been maintaining was slipping out of reach. The following days were marked by unease rather than resolution. Nick withdrew further, his behavior growing more erratic, his presence in the house unpredictable. Rob and Michelle confided to friends that they were scared, a word they had avoided for years. It was not fear rooted in blame, but fear born from uncertainty, from the realization that despite all their effort, they could no longer guarantee safety within their own home. The previous police visits, once seen as isolated incidents, now felt like warnings that had been waiting patiently for someone to connect the dots. On the afternoon, everything collapsed. The routine of the day offered no hint of what was about to happen. The massage appointment had been scheduled as it always was, an ordinary marker of time in a household that relied on structure. When the therapist arrived and received no response, the silence felt wrong in a way that defied logic. Calls went unanswered. Messages went unread. The decision to contact Romy was made quickly, driven by instinct rather than certainty. When she arrived, she carried none of the dread that would later define her memory of that moment. The shock that followed was absolute. Her mind did not process events in sequence. There was no narrative, no meaning, only an overwhelming sensory collapse that left her unable to function. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of sirens, flashing lights, and strangers moving through spaces that had once felt private. Early reports misunderstood key details, and those misunderstandings spread faster than corrections could catch up. Rumors filled the gaps left by incomplete information, and in the vacuum of uncertainty, speculation thrived. Romy's behavior was scrutinized, her shock misread as suspicion, her silence interpreted as something it was not. What investigators saw, however, was a young woman in acute trauma, responding exactly as the human nervous system does when confronted with the unbearable. As police worked through the scene, the focus naturally shifted to who had been present and who had not. Nick was nowhere to be found. The absence intensified the urgency, not because conclusions had been drawn, but because time mattered. When he was located later that evening, the reality that had been building quietly for years finally broke through the surface. The family that had spent so long trying to protect him now faced the unthinkable possibility that the danger they feared had come from within. For Romy, the sequence of revelations was almost cruel in its timing. Before she could even begin to process the loss of her father, she learned that her mother was also gone. The grief arrived in layers, each one landing before the last had settled. And beneath it all lay a deeper, more complex sorrow, the realization that her brother, the person she shared childhood memories with, might be responsible for destroying the family they all loved. That knowledge did not arrive with certainty or anger, but with disbelief so profound it threatened to fracture her sense of reality. What makes this chapter of the story so devastating is not just the violence of the act itself, but the convergence of warning signs, love, fear, and timing. Nothing happened in isolation. Every choice, every adjustment, every attempt to help carried both intention and consequence. The tragedy did not erupt from nowhere. It emerged from a long struggle that had reached a breaking point, exposing how fragile the line can be between care and catastrophe. As investigators pieced together the final hours, the broader truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a story of sudden madness, but of a slow descent that had been unfolding in plain sight, hidden behind routine, optimism, and the desperate hope that tomorrow would finally bring relief. After the shock of discovery and the rapid escalation of the investigation, the consequences began to settle in ways that were quieter but no less devastating. The immediate chaos faded, replaced by a heavy stillness that wrapped itself around everyone involved. For the family, there was no clear moment when grief began, because it never arrived alone. It came tangled with disbelief, with guilt, with the exhausting pressure of being watched while trying to breathe. The house in Brentwood, once a place of movement and routine, became a sealed environment where every room carried an echo of what had been lost. Familiar spaces turned hostile, not because they had changed, but because memory refused to leave them untouched. For Romy, the days that followed blurred into a single emotional landscape defined by exhaustion. She was asked to recall details, timelines, conversations, all while her body was still reacting to trauma. Each question felt like reopening a wound that had not yet closed. The public, hungry for explanations, searched her expressions for meaning, her pauses for implication. What they could not see was the constant internal negotiation required just to remain present. Grief did not move in a straight line. It surged, retreated, and returned without warning, often colliding with the unbearable weight of what it meant to lose both parents at once. The loss extended beyond emotion into identity. Everything Romy understood about family was suddenly unstable. The idea of home no longer offered comfort. Even the memories that once felt safe were now shadowed by the knowledge of how they ended. Every moment of warmth was followed by the same unanswerable question of how such love could coexist with so much pain. And layered beneath her personal grief was another, more complicated sorrow, the fracture of a sibling bond that could never be repaired. The brother she grew up with became inseparable from the act that destroyed their family. Loving him and accepting what had happened felt mutually exclusive, forcing her to carry two opposing truths at the same time. The impact rippled outward. Friends who had once gathered freely now hesitated, unsure of how to approach someone whose life had been publicly dismantled. Some reached out immediately, offering support, while others pulled back, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the loss. Grief rearranged social dynamics, drawing some people closer and pushing others away. Silence became common, not from indifference, but from fear of saying the wrong thing. In that silence, isolation grew, reinforcing the sense that tragedy creates its own distance, even among those who cared deeply. The legal process brought a different kind of strain. Court dates, evaluations, and statements introduced structure, but not closure. Each development reopened the story, dragging it back into headlines and discussions that rarely captured its complexity. The possibility of an insanity defense sparked debate that extended far beyond the family. Some saw it as accountability deferred, others as recognition of illness rather than intent. For those closest to the situation, it was neither. It was another reminder that no legal outcome could undo what had been done or restore what was lost. The system could assign responsibility, but could not offer relief from the emotional aftermath. The broader community responded in predictable yet painful ways. Sympathy mixed with judgment, compassion with speculation. Mental illness became a talking point, but often stripped of nuance. Addiction was mentioned as context, but rarely explored with empathy. In the rush to make sense of the tragedy, many overlooked the years of effort that preceded it, the attempts to intervene, the resources spent, the nights spent awake hoping for improvement. The narrative flattened into something easier to consume, reducing a complex human story into a cautionary tale without acknowledging the unresolved questions at its core. Inside the family's inner circle, the weight of hindsight grew heavier by the day. Every past decision was reevaluated, every moment scrutinized for signs that might have been missed. Could something have been done differently? Should boundaries have been firmer? Was love expressed in ways that helped or harmed? These questions offered no answers, only the illusion of control in a situation defined by uncertainty. Regret, whether justified or not, became a constant companion, whispering possibilities that could never be tested. The emotional toll was compounded by the realization that recovery, in any traditional sense, was not possible. There was no return to normal, no timeline for healing. The future had to be reimagined from fragments of what remained. Grief demanded attention not just as an emotion, but as a force that reshaped priorities, relationships, and self-perception. Every plan now existed under the shadow of what had happened, altering expectations and redefining what survival looked like. Perhaps the most enduring consequence was the way silence transformed. Before, it had been a strategy, a way of managing problems privately, of protecting dignity and hope. Afterward, silence became a necessity, a space where words failed to capture the depth of loss. It was in that silence that the reality of the tragedy settled most fully, not as a single event, but as a permanent absence. The laughter that once filled the house did not simply stop. It became unimaginable. As time moved forward, the story did not end. It lingered, unresolved, in courtrooms, in private conversations, and in the internal lives of those left behind. The aftermath was not a clean chapter, but a long, uneven process of learning how to exist in a world permanently altered. The tragedy had taken lives, but it had also taken certainty, security, and the illusion that love alone could protect against everything. What remained was a family and a community forced to confront the limits of care, the failures of systems, and the enduring question of how to move forward when the past refuses to loosen its grip. There were stories that never reached the headlines, moments that existed only in memories shared quietly among those who had been close enough to witness them. In the weeks and months after the tragedy, these fragments surfaced slowly, not as revelations meant to shock, but as reminders of how much had been carried in silence long before everything collapsed. Friends began to recall late-night conversations with Rob, where his voice would soften, almost disappear, as he spoke about exhaustion rather than fear. He did not describe chaos or violence. He spoke about vigilance, about the strain of never fully relaxing, about listening for sounds in the house long after everyone else had gone to bed. He loved his son fiercely, but that love had evolved into a constant state of alertness, a readiness that left little room for rest. Michelle's private world held its own unspoken rituals. She kept schedules not just for appointments, but for emotional temperature, noting which days felt calmer and which ones required extra care. Those closest to her noticed how she would quietly reposition herself during gatherings, always choosing a seat that allowed her to see everyone at once. It was not anxiety in the conventional sense. It was adaptation, a way of staying prepared without alarming anyone else. She rarely complained. Instead, she focused on smoothing edges, redirecting tension, and preserving a sense of normalcy even when it felt increasingly fragile. Nick's isolation deepened in ways that were easy to overlook from the outside. While he lived in a separate guest house, physically close yet emotionally distant, his days often blurred together. He slept irregularly, wandered the property at odd hours, and withdrew from routines that once grounded him. Friends who crossed his path during that time described conversations that drifted without resolution, thoughts that looped back on themselves, and a growing sense that he was slipping further away from shared reality. These observations were not framed as warnings at the time. They were registered as concerns, filed away with the hope that treatment adjustments would eventually bring clarity. Romy occupied a different space in this hidden landscape. Her way of coping had always involved motion, projects, and creative immersion. She surrounded herself with collaborators, not out of avoidance, but as a way to stay anchored. One of those collaborators became particularly significant during this period, someone who understood her need for structure amid emotional instability. Their work together offered her a temporary refuge, a place where focus replaced fear. That connection would later be scrutinized by outsiders searching for meaning. Yet those who understood it saw something simpler, a lifeline built on trust during a time when trust felt increasingly rare. Behind these individual experiences lay a shared pattern of restraint. The family did not broadcast their struggles. They did not seek public sympathy or frame their lives as cautionary tales. Privacy was not secrecy, but an attempt to manage pain without amplifying it. This choice, however well-intentioned, created a paradox. By keeping their difficulties contained, they also limited the range of intervention available to them. Support came from professionals and a close circle of friends, but broader systems remained at a distance, unaware of the cumulative weight being carried. There were moments when hope flickered unexpectedly, periods when Nick appeared calmer, when conversations felt coherent, when laughter returned briefly to the house. These moments reinforced the belief that progress was possible, that the cycle could finally break. Each improvement reset expectations, making the next decline even harder to bear. In hindsight, these fluctuations formed a pattern that would later seem painfully clear. At the time, they were interpreted as signs that persistence might eventually be rewarded. One detail that rarely surfaced publicly was the emotional toll of constant decision-making. Every day required judgment calls about medication, boundaries, supervision, and trust. These were not choices with obvious answers. Each carried potential risks, and each was made under the pressure of love and responsibility. The weight of those decisions accumulated silently, contributing to a fatigue that was emotional rather than physical. It was the fatigue of caring deeply while knowing that outcomes could never be guaranteed. As stories circulated among friends after the tragedy, a common theme emerged: the sense that the family had been living in a prolonged state of anticipation, waiting for something to resolve without knowing what form that resolution would take. They hoped for recovery, feared escalation, and existed in the space between those two possibilities for far too long. The tragedy did not introduce chaos into their lives. It exposed the extent to which chaos had already been present, managed quietly and imperfectly through love and perseverance. These unspoken chapters do not offer simple lessons. They resist neat conclusions because they are rooted in human complexity rather than clear cause and effect. What they reveal instead is the emotional cost of endurance, the way sustained effort can erode resilience over time. They show how people can do everything they believe is right and still arrive at outcomes they never imagined. In these quiet stories lies a deeper understanding of the tragedy, not as a singular event, but as the culmination of countless moments where hope and fear coexisted, unresolved. The legacy of these hidden experiences is not defined by blame, but by recognition. Recognition that suffering often unfolds in ordinary settings, behind closed doors, carried by people who appear strong because they have no other choice. It is in acknowledging these unseen layers that the story gains its true weight, moving beyond spectacle into something closer to truth. And with that recognition comes a difficult question, one that lingers long after the details fade. How many similar stories remain unheard, waiting in silence for someone to notice the cost before it becomes irreversible? What remains after the facts are documented and the timeline settled is not clarity, but a kind of echo that refuses to fade. The story leaves behind a legacy shaped less by notoriety than by contradiction, a life defined by empathy colliding with forces empathy could not fully contain. Rob Reiner's career was built on the belief that understanding people was the first step toward change. His films often insisted that compassion mattered, that listening could bridge even the deepest divides. That belief did not disappear when the cameras stopped rolling. It followed him home, into the most intimate and difficult role he ever held, that of a father trying to protect his child from himself. In the aftermath, it becomes impossible to separate the man from the ideals he lived by. The same patience that allowed him to guide actors and stories toward emotional truth also guided his parenting. He believed that abandonment was the ultimate failure, that no matter how difficult things became, presence was a form of love that could not be replaced. This philosophy shaped every decision he and Michelle made, from funding treatment to adjusting their lives around Nick's needs. In that sense, the tragedy does not negate his values. It exposes their limits. Romy's reflections add another layer to this legacy. In speaking openly about her own struggles, she reframed the narrative around mental health within the family. She recognized that silence, even when meant to protect, can become a burden passed down quietly from one generation to the next. Her willingness to articulate pain did not undo what had happened, but it challenged the idea that strength requires secrecy. Through her voice, the story expanded beyond one household, touching on a broader cultural discomfort with acknowledging vulnerability until it becomes unavoidable. Nick's place in this legacy is the most difficult to confront. He exists at the intersection of illness, addiction, and consequence, a reminder that understanding does not always translate into safety. His life forces an uncomfortable reckoning with how society defines responsibility when mental health is involved. Treatment, forgiveness, and second chances were offered repeatedly, yet they could not prevent harm. This does not invalidate those efforts, but it complicates them, highlighting the painful truth that care does not guarantee control. The legacy also extends into questions about systems meant to intervene. Police visits, medical evaluations, and rehabilitation programs form a network of responses that addressed moments rather than patterns. Each intervention ended with the hope that stability had been restored, yet none resolved the underlying instability. The story reveals how easily long-term crises can slip through institutional gaps, especially when families shoulder the responsibility quietly. It challenges the assumption that resources alone are enough, pointing instead to the need for sustained, coordinated support that acknowledges how chronic and unpredictable severe mental illness can be. At its core, this legacy is not about failure, but about limits. It asks what happens when love reaches the edge of what it can manage, when patience becomes endurance, and when hope persists despite evidence that the situation is deteriorating. It confronts the uncomfortable reality that even the most well-intentioned actions can contribute to outcomes no one desires. In doing so, it resists simple moral judgments. There are no villains here in the traditional sense, only people navigating circumstances that steadily outgrew their capacity to contain them. For those watching from a distance, the story lingers because it mirrors fears that are rarely voiced. The fear that devotion might not be enough. The fear that doing everything possible still leaves room for irreversible loss. The fear that the qualities we admire most, compassion, loyalty, perseverance, can sometimes trap us in cycles that are difficult to escape. These reflections do not offer resolution, but they deepen understanding, shifting the focus from spectacle to substance. The enduring impact of this story lies in its ability to unsettle assumptions about control and certainty. It reminds us that mental health struggles do not unfold according to narratives of redemption or collapse alone. They exist in between, fluctuating, resisting closure. The legacy left behind is one of unanswered questions rather than definitive lessons. Questions about how families balance care with boundaries, how society supports those living with severe illness, and how silence can both protect and endanger. In the end, what Rob Reiner leaves behind is not only a body of work or a public reputation, but a deeply human story about striving to do right in circumstances that resist resolution. It is a legacy that invites reflection rather than judgment, asking us to consider not just what went wrong, but how much was carried quietly and persistently before everything gave way. And perhaps that is where its greatest weight lies, in forcing us to sit with discomfort, to recognize complexity, and to acknowledge that some struggles do not offer neat conclusions. Only the responsibility to look more closely the next time we encounter silence where there should be support. As the story reaches its quietest point, what remains is not a sense of closure, but a lingering stillness that feels heavier than any dramatic ending could offer. Time has moved forward, court dates have been scheduled, statements have been issued, Yet the emotional reality has not resolved itself into anything neat or complete. For those left behind, life continues in fragments, shaped by routines that exist alongside memories that refuse to soften. The tragedy does not fade into the past as a single chapter. It stretches forward, influencing every decision, every relationship, every attempt to imagine a future that looks different from the one that was lost. For Romy, survival has taken on a new meaning. It is no longer about momentum or productivity, but about learning how to coexist with grief without letting it define every breath. Some days are manageable, others feel impossibly heavy, and both realities exist without warning. The world still sees her, still expects movement, still measures strength by visibility. What it does not see is the private work of carrying love and loss at the same time, of honoring parents who are gone while reconciling the impossible truth of how they were lost. There is no script for this kind of endurance, no roadmap that explains how to hold compassion and devastation together without being torn apart. The family story has become a mirror for uncomfortable questions many prefer to avoid. It forces a reckoning with how society understands mental illness, not in theory, but in lived experience. It challenges the belief that resources alone can prevent tragedy, that enough care, enough money, enough effort will always be sufficient. Instead, it reveals how fragile those assumptions can be when illness is severe, unpredictable, and intertwined with addiction. The systems designed to help often react to moments rather than patterns, stepping in briefly before stepping away again, leaving families to navigate the long stretches in between. There is also a quieter lesson embedded in what happened, one that resists slogans or easy takeaways. It is the lesson of silence, how it can be both a refuge and a risk. The Reiners protected their privacy not out of denial, but out of dignity and hope. Yet that same silence limited how much the outside world could understand or intervene. It raises a difficult question without offering a simple answer. When does protecting loved ones from exposure begin to isolate them from help? And how do families decide where that line should be drawn when every option feels imperfect? As the public conversation gradually shifts elsewhere, the deeper implications remain. This story is not exceptional because of fame or wealth. It is exceptional only in how visible it became after years of invisibility. Similar struggles unfold quietly in countless homes, far from cameras and headlines, carried by people who appear functional until they suddenly are not. The difference is that most of those stories never reach a point where anyone is forced to pay attention. They remain hidden, unresolved, and ongoing. In that sense, the tragedy leaves behind an obligation rather than a conclusion. An obligation to look more closely when warning signs repeat instead of fade. An obligation to question systems that respond episodically to chronic crises. An obligation to reconsider how love, when unbounded by limits, can sometimes deepen harm rather than prevent it. These are not accusations. They are reflections born from loss, offered without certainty and without blame. What lingers most is the humanity at the center of it all. A father who believed deeply in empathy. A mother who dedicated herself to holding a family together. A daughter learning how to live with absence. A son whose illness and addiction placed him beyond the reach of the love meant to save him. None of these roles exist in isolation. Together, they form a story that resists judgment and demands understanding, even when understanding offers no comfort. As this chapter closes, the unanswered questions remain, not as mysteries to be solved, but as realities to be acknowledged. How many warnings are enough before action becomes unavoidable? How much responsibility can families reasonably carry on their own? And how many lives continue along similar paths, unseen, because silence feels safer than exposure? These questions do not belong only to this story. They belong to anyone willing to sit with its weight and recognize that behind every headline is a network of choices, fears, and hopes that once felt reasonable until they no longer were. If this story has stayed with you, if it has unsettled or challenged you, that reaction is part of its meaning. It was never meant to be consumed and forgotten. It asks for reflection, for attention, and for a willingness to engage with complexity rather than retreat from it. The conversation does not end here. It continues in how we listen, how we respond, and how we choose not to look away when silence begins to feel too familiar.